The scream tore through the morning like a knife. Ethan Miller, jolting awake at 4:15, convinced for a split second that something terrible had happened to his son. But the apartment was silent, the kind of silence that pressed on the chest and reminded him just how thin the walls were between survival and collapse. He lay still, breath-catching, before forcing himself upright. It was another day, another battle to stay afloat. And somewhere across the city, a man everyone dismissed as irrelevant was about to alter Ethan's entire life without ever saying a word. Outside, Denver was still dark, the streets glistening from a night drizzle traffic sparse enough to hear each car slice through the wet asphalt. Ethan stepped into the small kitchen, the single fluorescent bulb flickering like it too was exhausted. He packed Noah's inhaler, scribbled a note in his rushed, looping handwriting, and set oatmeal on the table with the quiet ritual of a man building stability from ashes. Every motion was careful, gentle, as if the world might shatter if he moved too quickly. Noah slept in the next room, curled under a faded dinosaur blanket, breathing softly. The boy was 6, sweet-natured, artistic, and fighting asthma with more courage than any child should need. Ethan paused at the doorway, watching his son the way a drowning man watches a rope thrown toward him. Then he left for work, feet dragging from fatigued shoulders, squared from necessity. Maple Street Diner sat on a corner of uptown Denver, an old relic wedged between high-rise apartments and trendy cafes. The sign buzzed with a faint electric hum, clinging to life the way Ethan clung to the job. Inside, the place smelled of burnt coffee and fried potatoes, soaked deep into the tiles like ghosts who refused to leave. The booths were cracked red vinyl, the counter dented from decades of impatient coins and greasy elbows. Most employees hated mornings. Ethan had long made peace with them. Patrick Malone, the diner's manager, squinted at him the moment he walked in. Patrick was in his late 50s with a permanent scowl etched into his features, as if cynicism had chiseled itself into the bone. 2 minutes late, he muttered, "Trains don't run faster just because you're a single dad." Ethan didn't bother defending himself. He simply tied his apron, locked his expression into a polite smile, and got to work. He moved with practiced grace, pouring coffee, flipping cups upright in one easy sweep, sliding between tables like someone dancing an unending choreography. Customers filed in. Regulars who tipped poorly, office workers glued to their phones, construction crews who barked orders too loudly. Ethan absorbed it all with a quiet endurance that no one saw, no one cared about, and yet had become the strongest part of him. At 7:10, the bell above the door jingled with a tired metallic chime, and the diner seemed to inhale differently. The man who stepped in was always the same Henry Whitmore. He walked with a slow, deliberate shuffle, shoulders slightly bent, but his eyes, pale blue and sharp, missed nothing. To the others, he was just an odd old man with fraying coats and silence thick as snowfall. But Ethan had watched him long enough to know there was something behind that silence, something coiled and waiting. Henry always chose the same corner booth, always ordered black coffee and whole grain toast, and always kept his hands hidden under the table, until Ethan arrived to cut the toast into neat squares for him. Henry never asked. Ethan simply noticed the tremors in the old man's knuckles. One morning took the dull diner knife gently from him and sliced the toast without a word. Henry had looked at him, then truly looked, and Ethan had felt a sudden spark of connection, a flicker so small he didn't fully understand it. But from then on, it became their ritual. Patrick thought Ethan wasted time. Denise, the other server, joked that maybe the old man would leave a miracle tip someday. But Henry left nothing more than exact change, an extra nickel at most. Ethan didn't mind. Serving him created a strange quietness inside Ethan's day. a pocket of stillness where he wasn't failing, where someone actually seemed to see him. This morning, Henry watched Ethan with a gaze that felt heavier than usual. It wasn't unkind, just searching, probing, as though the old man were examining a clue only he could decipher. "You're tired," Henry finally said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. Ethan froze. Henry rarely spoke beyond a few clipped phrases. Hearing his voice now felt like hearing a stone whisper. "Long night," Ethan answered softly, keeping his tone light. "My son had trouble breathing again." A shadow crossed Henry's features, something like recognition and sadness wrapped together. "Your boy," he murmured. "How old? 6. Good age." Henry stirred his coffee slowly. "Hard age too, especially alone." Ethan didn't ask how Henry knew he was alone. The truth clung to him like the faint scent of disinfectant on his shirt. "We manage," he said. "Some days better than others." Henry's eyes softened, the corners crinkling in a way that made him appear younger, almost kind. A strange tension flickered in the air a moment that felt as if Henry wanted to say more, tell something heavy and old. Instead, he sipped his coffee, swallowed hard, and looked away. And Ethan, a man who was always running, always bracing for the next blow, felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, a ripple rather than a quake. But he could sense it, the realization that this quiet, overlooked customer carried secrets far larger than his worn coat suggested. Something about him felt out of place, like a king dressed as a beggar. No one else saw it. No one else cared. That morning, Ethan moved faster, the diner louder with the rush. But Henry remained still in his corner, watching Ethan with the silent intensity of someone memorizing every detail. Across the room, Denise muttered, "That old guy creeps me out." Patrick scoffed. "He's harmless. Probably just lonely." Ethan wasn't so sure. Henry looked lonely, yes, but harmless. There was something in those pale eyes that didn't match his fragile frame, something powerful, hidden. When Ethan returned with a refill, Henry said quietly, "You're a good man." The words hit like a punch. Ethan felt his throat close up, the compliment landing somewhere deep, far deeper than the old man could possibly know. "Thank you," Ethan whispered. "I try." Henry nodded once, as though confirming a calculation he had already made. Outside, the drizzle had turned to steady rain, the windows streaked with silver lines. Ethan wiped a table, humming under his breath, unaware that Henry's gaze lingered on him with the weight of judgment and the tenderness of farewell. Because in less than 24 hours, Henry Whitmore would be dead. And Ethan Miller, the man no one noticed, would discover that the quiet stranger in the corner booth had seen everything and left him a storm he was never meant to survive. Ethan learned the truth the way people often learn the worst things in their lives, abruptly, without warning, like a trap door giving way beneath his feet. His phone buzzed at 8:30 that night. The caller ID was a hospital number. For one terrifying instant, he thought it was about Noah. But it wasn't. It was about someone he barely knew, yet someone whose absence suddenly felt like a wrench to the ribs. Henry Whitmore had been found unresponsive in his townhouse, pronounced dead sometime before dawn. Natural causes, they said. Peaceful, they said. But the words hit Ethan like a slap. Peaceful was not how it felt. He sat on the edge of his worn couch, the springs groaning beneath him, the small apartment dim except for the soft glow from Noah's nightlight in the next room. He didn't understand why his chest hurt. How could he grieve a man who had barely spoken 50 words to him? But grief didn't care about logic. It cared about connections, about the strange gravity between people who saw each other even when they didn't speak. Ethan reached for a glass of water, but his hands trembled. He remembered Henry's last look that morning, the way the older man's gaze had lingered, as if memorizing him, storing him away. A farewell disguised as silence. He barely slept that night. When dawn broke, he moved like a man underwater, preparing Noah's breakfast, writing the little note his son loved to find in the mornings. Outside, the sky was pale gray, the air heavy. Ethan boarded the early train to the diner, hoping the rhythm of routine would anchor him. It didn't. The diner felt wrong, as if missing a piece of its structure. No bell at 7:10, no shuffle of worn shoes, no pale blue eyes studying him from the corner booth. Ethan filled orders, refilled coffee, but a thread of unease pulled tight in his chest. At 8, he cut toast into squares out of habit, then froze the knife hovering midair. Patrick barked at him for zoning out. Denise shot him an annoyed look. Ethan barely heard them. At 8:45, the door opened, and the diner fell strangely still. 4 men in black suits entered first, moving with the precision of trained predators. Broad shoulders, expressionless faces. Their eyes scanned the diner with quiet threat. Then came a 5th man, older, sharp-featured, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to command. The kind of man who didn't walk into places like Maple Street Diner unless he had a purpose heavy enough to crush concrete. He walked straight toward Ethan. "You are Ethan Miller," the man said. Not a question, a verdict. Ethan nodded, heart pounding. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" "My name is Richard Hayes. I am the personal attorney of the late Mr. Henry Whitmore." The world blurred. Ethan gripped the counter to steady himself. Patrick muttered something under his breath. Denise stared openly. Hayes' continued voice calm, but carrying a weight that pulled every pair of eyes toward them. "Mr. Whitmore left explicit instructions regarding you. Your immediate presence is required at our firm. A car is waiting." Ethan blinked. There must be some mistake. I just served him breakfast. "I don't understand." "There is no mistake." Hayes replied, softer but unyielding. "Mr. Whitmore spoke of you often. Please gather your belongings. We will explain everything once you arrive." Patrick stormed forward. "Hold on. He's working. You can't just drag my employee out in the middle of a shift." Hayes glanced at him with a level of disdain so quiet it felt lethal. "Mr. Malone, you have not been the owner of this diner for months. Your position here is managerial only. You may verify that with your accounting records if you wish." Patrick's face drained of blood. Denise's tray slipped from her grip, sandwiches collapsing across the counter. Ethan felt the floor tilt under his feet. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Hayes gestured toward the door. "Mr. Whitmore prepared for this. You will be briefed. Please come with us." 100 emotions collided inside Ethan: shock, fear, confusion, a relentless pounding grief, but the attorney's presence left no room for refusal. He untied his apron, grabbed his backpack, and followed them outside. A black Lincoln waited by the curb. One of the guards opened the door. Ethan caught a glimpse of the diners pressed against the windows, watching as though witnessing someone being abducted into another reality. Inside the car, the smell of leather and cold air conditioning wrapped around him. Hayes sat across from him, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. The city blurred through the tinted windows as the car glided through Denver's morning traffic. Mr. Miller Hayes began, voice measured. "I imagine this is overwhelming." Henry Whitmore was not a simple man, nor was the connection he formed with you simple. Ethan swallowed hard. "I barely knew him." "That is not true," Hayes said gently. "You knew the part he valued most, his humanity." Ethan stared confused. Hayes continued. "Mr. Whitmore lived the last years of his life in near total isolation. He distrusted those around him, Most saw only his wealth. They ignored the man. You were the exception. Ethan shook his head. I just cut his toast. You treated him with dignity, Hayes replied. More than that, you treated him with warmth. He noticed everything, more than you can imagine. The car slowed as they approached a steel and glass tower downtown. The Whitmore Law Building etched in silver across the entrance. Ethan stepped out, legs unsteady, and followed Hayes through marble floors, past security guards who greeted Hayes with crisp nods. They entered a private elevator. Hayes withdrew a key card and inserted it. The elevator hummed to life. You should prepare yourself, Hayes said quietly. Mr. Whitmore left something significant for you. Not money alone, something larger. The elevator doors opened to a conference room bathed in winter light. And inside, waiting with stiff, offended expressions, were a woman in her mid-50s and a man in his late 20s, elegant, furious, and unmistakably wealthy. The air crackled with tension. Charlotte Whitmore, Brandon Whitmore. The heir and the would-be heir. Charlotte looked Ethan up and down with open contempt. This is the waiter, Brandon scoffed. Grandfather must have lost his mind. Hayes raised a hand sharply. Sit, both of you. The will cannot proceed without all parties present. Ethan stood frozen, pulse pounding in his ears. In that single suspended moment, he saw it clearly. He didn't just stumble into someone else's world. He had been expected, planned for, chosen. And whatever Henry had left behind was about to drag Ethan Miller, the man everyone underestimated, into a battle he never asked for, but one he suddenly sensed he was meant to fight. The room felt too bright, too silent, too sharp. Ethan Miller stood at the head of the long, polished table, swallowed by the tension radiating from the two Whitmore heirs. Charlotte Whitmore's stare was a blade, cool and precise. Brandon's was a fire barely contained. Both seemed to be waiting for Ethan to apologize for breathing the same air. Richard Hayes placed a leather folder on the table and opened it with the ceremonial weight of a priest revealing scripture. This, he announced, is the final will and testament of Mr. Henry Whitmore. Charlotte lifted her chin lips, drawn tight. Let's dispense with melodrama, Richard. We already know what father intended. The estate passes to the family. Hayes didn't look at her. You will refrain from assumptions until the reading is complete. Brandon groaned. You're seriously giving this busboy a front row seat. What could he possibly have to do with anything Ethan wanted to shrink? Instead, something inside him steadied. A small voice whispered that Henry had seen something in him, something these two couldn't recognize if it were engraved in gold. Hayes began reading. His voice carried through the glass-lined room with a slow, deliberate gravity. To my daughter-in-law, Charlotte Whitmore, I leave the fund previously designated for her maintenance and residence. To my grandson, Brandon Whitmore, I leave the monetary assets held in the Whitmore Trust. Charlotte and Brandon exchanged a satisfied, bored glance. This apparently was what they expected. But Hayes's pause cut the air clean, and to the man who restored a dignity, I had forgotten to the only person who treated me as human. In my final years, I leave the remainder of my personal estate. The room shattered into chaos. Charlotte stood so abruptly, her chair screeched backward. No, absolutely not. Father would never. Brandon slammed his palms on the table. You're lying. He barely knew this guy. Hayes lifted a hand for silence. Sit. The word fell with the force of a command from a judge. Even the heirs seemed to obey. Reluctantly, the two Whitmores lowered themselves back into their seats. Ethan stared at Hayes, stunned, speechless. I think there's been a mistake. Henry didn't even know my last name. Hayes shook his head. He knew far more than you think. He opened a second envelope and withdrew a document stamped with official seals. Mr. Whitmore transferred ownership of Maple Street Diner 6 months ago. He operated it under a subsidiary to avoid interference. Effective immediately, the diner belongs to you. Ethan felt the floor tilt again. Belongs to me, Hayes nodded. Yes. And additionally, Mr. Whitmore established an operational fund in conjunction with the diner. A long-term investment portfolio valued at approximately $5.5 million. Charlotte gasped. Brandon went pale. Ethan could only whisper, No, this isn't possible. Hayes's expression softened. Mr. Whitmore was thorough. He arranged every detail himself. The heirs exploded. He was senile, Brandon shouted. You manipulated him. Charlotte snapped at Ethan, her voice shaking with fury. Ethan could barely breathe. I didn't do anything. I just served him coffee. Hayes tapped the table sharply. Enough. Henry Whitmore was of sound mind. He completed psychological evaluations as required for estate transfers of this magnitude. None showed impairment. The will stands. Brandon's voice cracked like breaking glass. Over my dead body. Hayes turned to him with a cold finality. Test the will if you wish. You will lose. The silence that followed felt brittle, unstable. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. His world was flipping faster than he could catch it. Hayes continued. There is one final instruction. Mr. Miller, you are to accompany me to Mr. Whitmore's private residence for a sealed communication he left specifically for you. Charlotte's voice thinned. He hardly spoke to him. Hayes looked at her. He spoke to him more than he spoke to either of you in the last decade. Ethan saw the pain behind Charlotte's eyes, then real pain, raw and unhidden. For a moment, she looked like a woman standing under the weight of an entire past she didn't know how to carry. Brandon, however, was trembling with a different emotion altogether. This isn't over, he hissed, pointing at Ethan as if aiming a weapon. You're stealing my family's legacy. Ethan's voice was barely audible. I don't want your legacy. Hayes corrected him gently. It isn't theirs. It never was. And it is not yours to refuse, Mr. Miller. It is Mr. Whitmore's final will. The heirs stormed out, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows. The sudden quiet made Ethan aware of his own heartbeat. Hayes exhaled, closing the folder with care. I know this is overwhelming. Ethan laughed breathlessly, a sound between disbelief and panic. Overwhelming, I'm a waiter. A single dad who's barely keeping the lights on. Why would Henry give me his entire life? Hayes studied him for a moment, his gaze measuring thoughtful. Because, Mr. Miller, sometimes people spend decades surrounded by privilege and never once encounter sincerity. You gave him what money never could. You saw him. Ethan leaned back, chest tight, mind racing with fear, gratitude, confusion, and guilt, tangled into knots he couldn't name. I didn't do anything special. Exactly, Hayes replied. And that is why you were special. They left the room together, the echo of the heir's anger still lingering like smoke. Hayes guided him toward the elevator. As the doors slid shut, Ethan glimpsed his reflection in the polished steel. A tired man, a poor man, a man in over his head. But there was something else in his eyes too. Something Henry must have seen long before Ethan ever believed it existed. A strength, a quiet buried power. And now, whether he wanted it or not, everything was about to change. The moment Ethan stepped through the doors of the Whitmore townhouse, he felt as if he had crossed into another dimension, one where he did not belong, one where every polished surface reflected a life he had never touched. The foyer stretched upward in sweeping arcs of stone and glass, the kind of silent grandeur that made even breath feel intrusive. But what shocked him more was not the wealth. It was the emptiness. A mansion that had once held laughter, then secrets, and now only shadows. Richard Hayes walked ahead with quiet purpose, his footsteps echoing across the marble. Mr. Whitmore did not entertain visitors, he explained. Most rooms have not been entered in years. Ethan followed palms damp, every nerve buzzing. He could not shake the urge to turn and run back to the simple clutter of his apartment, to the warm weight of his son's backpack by the door to a life that made sense even when it hurt. But a force larger than fear kept pulling him forward, a sense that Henry had dragged him here. For a reason deeper than money or gratitude. Hayes paused at a heavy wooden door, carved with intricate ivy patterns. He inserted a brass key. The lock clicked with a sound that reverberated down the hall like a held breath released. This, Hayes murmured, was Mr. Whitmore's private study. The door creaked open. Ethan stepped into a room that felt alive with memory. Warm amber light filtered through tall windows, illuminating shelves of books crammed so tightly they bowed the wood. Papers lay stacked in disciplined piles across an enormous mahogany desk. A fireplace framed a single leather armchair, worn and cracked at the edges, the only thing here that looked truly used. But what stopped Ethan cold was the wall. An entire floor-to-ceiling panel was covered with pinned photographs, handwritten notes, legal documents, and newspaper clippings, all connected with colored threads that crisscrossed in a web of startling complexity. It resembled a detective's investigation board. Only this one seemed to investigate a lifetime. Hayes stayed by the door, giving Ethan the space to absorb it. Ethan approached slowly, breath shallow. He saw black and white photos of Henry as a young man, handsome, confident, standing beside a woman with sunlight in her smile and a baby in her arms. A family frozen in time, then a newspaper clipping about her tragic car accident. Another about Henry's son lost in a mountaineering fall. The grief etched into Henry's eyes in every later photograph was unmistakable. Next to those were stock reports, encrypted charts, Whitmore Industries filings board minutes annotated in Henry's slanted handwriting. Underlined names, circled figures, words like betrayal and siphoned funds and vote manipulation. Ethan's pulse spiked. "What is all this?" his battlefield Hayes said softly. Mr. Whitmore was fighting a private war the last decade of his life. Against his own family. Against the very people who sought to dismantle everything he built. Ethan stared at Brandon's name on several documents, red thread connecting it to financial anomalies, concealed partnerships, bribes, each piece an accusation more damning than the last. Hayes walked to the desk, retrieved a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written in Henry's trembling script. He held it out. "This is for you." Ethan took it carefully, as though it were fragile. Maybe it was. He opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. Henry's handwriting tilted unevenly, but carried unmistakable clarity. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have stepped into the storm I could no longer weather alone. You gave me kindness with no expectation. You saw me as human when others saw a burden. You reminded me of who I was before grief carved out my insides. I watched you far longer than you realized. Not to test you, to understand you. To know whether the legacy my wife dreamed of could still live in someone's hands. You were my answer. The diner reminded her of home. She wanted a place where everyone felt seen. You revived that dream without knowing it existed. There is one more task I must ask of you. Whitmore Industries faces a reckoning. My grandson believes himself destined to rule, but he has neither the heart nor the discipline. He will destroy everything. Enclosed is a single voting share. It grants you the right to attend the annual board meeting. You will know what to do when the moment comes. My greatest regret is that I realized too late what truly matters. I hope you will not make the same mistake. Take care of your boy, and take care of yourself. With respect, Henry Whitmore. Ethan read the letter twice, 3 times, his chest tightening with each line. Someone like Henry, rich, brilliant, battle-scarred, had chosen him a man scraping by on diner tips to carry his final fight. It made no sense, yet it made perfect, aching sense. Ethan whispered, "Why me?" Hayes answered quietly. Because Henry believed power without humanity is destruction, and humanity without power dies unheard. He saw both in you. Ethan's pulse hammered. I don't know anything about corporations or boardrooms. I can't fight people like Brandon. I can barely pay rent. Hayes met his gaze. You underestimate yourself? Henry did not, but Ethan wasn't convinced. Fear churned inside him, sharp and cold. He imagined standing before a room of executives being torn apart by people who viewed him as a stain on their polished floors. He imagined failing Henry's last request. He imagined Noah growing up with a father who couldn't rise when asked to. Hayes continued, sensing his turmoil. You are not meant to replace Henry's power. You are meant to reveal Brandon's corruption, and you are not alone. Henry left you more than a letter. Hayes crossed to a locked drawer in the desk. He unlocked it and withdrew a slim folder. Inside were documents stamped confidential, a USB drive, and a handwritten note, use only, if necessary. Ethan stared at the items, dread mingling with a strange, rising resolve. Hayes closed the drawer. This is why Henry chose you. Not because you are powerful, because you are principled. And that is the one weapon Brandon cannot anticipate. Ethan looked back at the wall of Henry's life. The joy, the grief, the war. Slowly, he nodded. Not because he was ready, but because he understood. Some legacies aren't inherited. They're entrusted. And Ethan Miller had just become the unlikely guardian of a dying man's last hope. Ethan did not realize he had stopped breathing until the elevator doors closed behind him, sealing him inside the quiet steel chamber with Richard Hayes. The enormity of Henry's world, his grief, his war, his trust, still pulsed in Ethan's veins like a second heartbeat. He clutched the folder Hayes had handed him, feeling its weight as something more dangerous than any weapon he had ever held. It contained truth. Truth with teeth. The elevator descended with a soft hum. Hayes stood beside him in calm silence, as if he had escorted chosen successors into storms like this many times. But Ethan could feel the man's eyes occasionally study him, measuring what Henry had already decided. When the doors opened onto the street, Denver's late afternoon sun stabbed through the glass too bright after the dim gravity of the study. Ethan blinked hard. The world outside hadn't changed. Cars passed. People hurried across crosswalks. A bus hissed as it came to a stop. Everything was normal, except nothing was normal. Hayes guided him to the sidewalk. Mr. Miller, he began, voice steady, there is one more matter. Ethan half laughed. There's more. Hayes didn't smile. You must understand what comes next. Brandon Whitmore will not accept this quietly. Ethan swallowed. I'm nobody to him. You are the threat he feared, Hayes corrected. The unpredictable variable. The person his grandfather trusted over him. Ethan stared at the pavement. I didn't ask for any of this. Hayes's gaze softened. Legacies seldom ask permission. A black sedan approached the curb. Not the limousine from earlier, something simpler, less conspicuous. Hayes gestured. "This will take you home." Ethan hesitated. "You're not coming." "No," Hayes said. "My work today is done. Yours is just beginning." The certainty in his voice carved a cold line down Ethan's spine. He slid into the back seat as the car pulled away from the curb. Denver's streets blurred by, but his mind saw only two things: Noah's face and Henry's letter. The words burned behind his eyes. "You will know what to do when the moment comes." No, Ethan thought. "I won't. I don't belong there." But another voice rose underneath, quiet but stubborn. "Maybe you do." He pressed his palms together, fighting the urge to tear everything apart: the letter, the folder, the bizarre new reality that had erupted around him. He didn't want power. He didn't want enemies. He wanted to keep his son safe, pay rent on time, serve coffee, without feeling like the world was collapsing. Yet he could feel Henry's belief in him, like a hand on his shoulder, urging him forward. The car turned into the narrow alley behind his apartment building. Ethan climbed out, still dazed. The sky had shifted to a muted gold shadows, stretching long across the cracked pavement. He took the steps two at a time and unlocked the apartment door. The moment he entered, Noah barreled into him with the force of a tiny hurricane. "Dad. Dad, look, I made a dragon." The boy thrust a crayon drawing into his hands, bright colors spiraling across the page. Ethan sank to a knee and hugged him fiercely, breathing in the warm, familiar scent of peanut butter and detergent. "It's amazing, buddy." Noah pulled back, eyes wide. "Why are you late? Mrs. Daniels picked me up from school. You never forget." Guilt punched Ethan in the stomach. "I'm sorry. Something important happened." "More important than me?" Noah asked in the way only children can, soft, vulnerable, devastating. "Nothing is more important than you," Ethan whispered. He meant it, every syllable. But when Noah ran off to show him another drawing, Ethan's gaze drifted to the sealed folder in his hand. Henry had given him something that could protect or destroy. Something that could reshape lives, maybe even save the diner, give Noah a future more stable than survival. But there was a shadow growing at the edge of the blessing. Brandon Whitmore. Ethan didn't know the man, but he knew the look he had seen in the conference room. Entitlement sharpened into violence. Brandon had grown up in privilege, had never been told no, had never tasted struggle. And now Henry had given his legacy to a stranger with a cheap backpack and worn shoes. Brandon would go to war. Ethan set the folder on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might move. His mind spun with questions. Why me? What exactly had Henry intended? How could he possibly step into a corporate battlefield when he barely understood its language? A knock shattered his spiraling thoughts. Sharp, hard, urgent. Ethan froze. The knock came again, louder. He stood slowly, moved toward the door. His pulse throbbed in his wrists. Dad, Noah whispered from down the hall. "It's okay," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure. "Stay in your room." He opened the door a few inches, and his world twisted again. Brandon Whitmore stood on the landing, face storm, shadow, jaw clenched hard enough to crack. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes were wild. Two men flanked him, men who were clearly not chauffeurs or assistants. Ethan's grip on the door tightened. "How did you find my address?" Brandon smiled without warmth. "Money finds everything." Ethan stepped back instinctively. "You need to leave." "Oh, I'm not here to hurt you," Brandon said, voice dripping with something far more menacing than violence. "I'm here to educate you." He leaned in closer, breath cold. "You think my grandfather chose you because you're special. because you're noble, no. He chose you because he wanted to punish me. And you're the perfect weapon. Cheap, disposable. Ethan's jaw locked. I didn't ask for any of this. That's exactly why you're going to hand it over, Brandon hissed. The diner, the money, the share, all of it. I can't, Ethan said. It's not mine to give. Brandon's smile twisted. Everything is yours to give, or to lose. One of the men beside him reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a thin envelope. He held it out to Ethan. Brandon tapped it. Inside is a list of your debts, your work history, your outstanding medical bills, and your son's condition. You're leveraged, Miller. One wrong move and everything collapses. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Brandon stepped back, eyes gleaming with triumph. Think about your boy. Then he turned and descended the stairs, his men following him, like shadows peeling away into the dusk. When they were gone, Ethan closed the door with shaking hands. He knew then, with a horrifying clarity, that Henry had not only left him a legacy, he had left him a battlefield. And the first shot had already been fired. For a long time after Brandon vanished into the deepening dusk, Ethan stood motionless, one hand braced against the door and the echo of the confrontation vibrating through his bones. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls tightening as though the space itself recoiled from the threat that had just invaded it. His breath came unevenly. His palms were slick. And in the hallway behind him, the soft creak of Noah's bedroom door reminded him with brutal clarity of what was at stake. He forced his voice steady. You okay, buddy? Noah appeared holding his dragon drawing like a shield. Who was at the door? Ethan swallowed. Just someone from work. Why did he sound mean? Adults say stupid things when they're angry, Ethan said gently. Nothing for you to worry about. Noah studied him, sensing more than a child should, and nodded slowly before returning to his room. Only when the door clicked shut did Ethan's shoulders sag. He walked to the kitchen table and stared at the folder Henry had left for him. Its edges seemed sharper now, as if it had grown teeth. Brandon's words replayed poisonous and precise. Cheap. Disposable. Ethan had heard variations of those judgments his entire adult life. From bosses, from Emily before she walked away, from people who didn't know him at all. But hearing them from a man born into the kind of power that could erase him without leaving a trace that was different, that was terrifying. He sank into one of the mismatched kitchen chairs and dropped his head into his hands. Fear churned inside him, fierce and cold. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't someone who won battles. He was someone who scraped by, who patched life together with grit and exhaustion, who survived. And yet he lifted his head and looked around the small apartment. The thrift store furniture, the peeling paint on the door frames, the handmade drawings taped to the fridge. Everything he had, everything he protected, was fragile. But the boy sleeping down the hall was not fragile. He was the reason Ethan woke every morning before dawn and pushed through each day when his body felt broken. Noah was the one thing he would burn the world down for if he had to. And that meant he couldn't walk away. He picked up the folder. The air felt heavier. He opened it. Inside were files arranged with meticulous care. Financial reports, email printouts, transaction logs that detailed money siphoned through shell companies. Notes in Henry's handwriting describing board members, their alliances, their weaknesses. Evidence. Stacks of it. Enough to uproot an empire if placed in the right hands. But the most explosive item was a small card taped to a sheet of paper, a single voting share embossed with the Whitmore seal. The card shimmered faintly under the kitchen light. It was nothing more than printed stock and ink. Yet it held the power to ignite war. Ethan exhaled slowly. "What were you thinking, Henry?" He knew the answer before the question left his mouth. Henry hadn't chosen Ethan for wealth or education or corporate sharpness. He chose him because Ethan wasn't corruptible. He chose him because Ethan had nothing except integrity. And integrity was the one thing Brandon couldn't fight with money. Ethan closed the folder. The decision settled in his chest like a final stone falling into place. He would go to the board meeting. He would present Henry's truth. He would not be intimidated into silence. But he would not survive alone. He picked up his phone and dialed Hayes. The attorney answered on the second ring. "Mr. Miller, I expected your call." How, Ethan asked, stunned by the certainty in his voice, because Henry understood people. And I understand the way storms form. A beat of quiet. "Tell me what happened." Ethan explained everything: Brandon's visit, the threats, the envelope listing his debts, and Noah's medical records. On the other end, Hayes' silence grew sharper, then colder. "Listen carefully," Hayes said. "You and your son are now targets of leverage. That is Brandon's only weapon." But Henry anticipated this. He instructed me to provide protection if the heirs attempted intimidation. "Protection," Ethan repeated. "What does that even mean? This isn't my world." "It is now," Hayes said. "And you are not defenseless. Come to my office tomorrow morning, early, before sunrise." "Why?" "Because we are going to prepare you for a fight that Brandon Whitmore thinks you cannot win." A chill rippled through Ethan. "And can I?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice held something dangerously close to respect. "Mr. Miller, Henry built an empire by reading people's souls. The last judgment he made in his life was choosing you. Do not underestimate what that means." Ethan ended the call and sat in the quiet dark of the city's distant sirens threading through the silence like thin wires. He thought of Henry's study, the wall of tangled threads, the remnants of a man trying to hold his world together while it fractured underneath him. A man who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and still believed in someone as unremarkable as a diner server, with nothing but heart left to give. Ethan stood and moved to Noah's room. The boy slept curled on his side, breathing softly, the dragon drawing now resting on the floor. Ethan picked it up and placed it carefully on the nightstand. "I'm going to keep you safe," he whispered. It wasn't a vow. It was a verdict. And it was the moment Ethan Miller stopped being the man life pushed around. He didn't know strategy. He didn't know corporate law. He didn't know how to stand in front of a boardroom filled with people who would laugh at him the second he walked in. But he knew how to fight for his son. And that made him more dangerous than Brandon Whitmore would ever be. Outside, the night deepened, stretching across the city like a warning. But inside apartment 2B, a man with nothing had just become a man with something worth destroying. And that made him powerful. Dawn arrived bruised and gray, the kind of light that looked unsure of itself. Ethan stepped out of the train at 5:20 in the morning, and the city still half asleep, the air sharp against his lungs. He clutched the folder Henry had left him, now tucked inside his backpack, like a volatile secret waiting to detonate. Every step toward Hayes' office felt heavier than the last, as if he were walking not on pavement, but through the shifting weight of what he was about to do. Hayes was already waiting in the lobby when Ethan arrived. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression carved from calm steel. "Mr. Miller," he greeted, "today will be difficult." Ethan huffed out a breath. Yesterday wasn't exactly a picnic. A tiny smile flickered at the corner of Hayes's mouth, not amusement, but acknowledgement. Fair point. They stepped into the private elevator. As the doors closed, Hayes said, "Before we begin, understand this, every moment from now, until the board meeting, is preparation. This is not a battle won with strength. It is won with clarity, precision, and the ability to stay standing even when you are drowning." Great Ethan muttered. "Sounds easy. It isn't. But you are capable of more than you think." The elevator chimed softly and opened onto a high-floor conference suite, walls of glass, a long table, and screens already lit with documents. Hayes moved with quiet command. "Sit." Ethan obeyed, heart-pounding palms damp. Hayes activated the screens. Complex webs of financial trails, emails, reports, and incriminating charts glowed into existence. "This," he said, "is Henry's evidence." Ethan stared at the impossible labyrinth of wrongdoing. Brandon actually did all of this, not alone. Hayes replied. He had help from board members aligned with his interests, but he orchestrated the siphoning, the falsified audits, and the cover-ups. Ethan swallowed hard. "And I'm supposed to expose him." "You are supposed to reveal the truth," Hayes corrected. "The truth does the exposing for you." Ethan scrubbed a hand through his hair. "I'm not trained for this. I serve pancakes, Richard. I serve coffee. Half the customers don't even remember my name." Hayes leaned forward. "And Henry Whitmore remembered everything. He chose you deliberately." "Why," Ethan demanded, "this whole thing is insane." Hayes paused, his voice lowering, "Because people like Brandon only know how to fight other people like Brandon. Wealth, power, ego. But Henry believed the only force stronger than corruption is conscience. You cannot be bought. You cannot be bribed. You cannot be flattered into blindness. You are the one variable Brandon cannot predict." Ethan's chest tightened. "But that doesn't mean I can win." "Winning isn't the requirement," Hayes said. "Surviving long enough to speak is." The words landed with a cold finality. Hayes continued guiding him through the evidence, which documents mattered, which figures revealed theft, which emails exposed collusion. Hours slipped by in a blur of screens, signatures, timelines. At times, Ethan felt his mind stretching to its limits, but every time exhaustion threatened, the thought of Noah pulled him back with sharp clarity. Then came the final lesson. Hayes placed the single voting share on the table. "This is your entry into the boardroom. They cannot bar you. They cannot silence you. You will be allowed to speak." Ethan stared at the small piece of embossed paper. It felt like both a shield and a target. "And what do I say?" he asked quietly. Hayes studied him. "You speak the truth, not with fear, not with apology. You speak as the man Henry believed you to be." Ethan didn't answer. His thoughts were racing too fast, tangled too tightly to form words. But the day wasn't done. The suite door opened without warning, and a woman entered, tall, composed, carrying a leather portfolio and an air of honed professionalism. "This," Hayes said, "is Megan O'Connell, Henry's former strategy advisor. She agreed to help you." Megan offered Ethan a hand and a reassuring firm shake. "I've read everything about this situation. I'm impressed you're still standing." "Trust me," Ethan said softly. "It feels like I'm not." She pulled out documents of her own. "Then let me give you the one advantage Brandon doesn't expect." Ethan looked up, wary but hopeful. "Perception," Megan said. "In a room full of titans, arrogance blinds them. They will underestimate you. Use that. Don't pretend to be a corporate expert. Be exactly who you are." "A diner server," Ethan said, incredulous. "A man with something to lose," she corrected. "A man Henry trusted. A man with moral authority none of them can fake. Megan leaned closer. People in power crack when confronted with truth spoken by someone who has nothing to gain. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a small stubborn ignition. Hayes watched him carefully. "Mr. Miller, the board meeting is tomorrow morning. Brandon will come prepared to bury you. He will weaponize his charisma, his intimidation, and his influence. But you have something he doesn't." Ethan asked quietly, "What's that purpose?" The word landed like a spark in dry grass. Purpose. He had lived so long just trying to survive that he had forgotten what it felt like to move with direction, to stand for something, to be chosen for something. By late afternoon, Ethan stepped out of the Whitmore building, exhausted, mind-buzzing fear coiling under his ribs, but something new flickered beneath the fear. Conviction. He walked through downtown Denver, the wind cold the city rushing past him, but his steps firmer than that morning. When he reached his apartment, Noah ran to him again, chattering about school, about a friend's new puppy, about superheroes. Ethan listened, smiling, kneeling, so his eyes were level with his son's. "You okay, Dad?" Noah asked. Ethan rested a hand on his son's cheek. "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay." But he wasn't just okay, he was ready. Later that night, after Noah fell asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Henry's folder open before him. He reviewed every line, every figure, every signature. Each truth sharpened him, carved away the fear left behind something solid. Tomorrow the battle would begin. A waiter in a boardroom of sharks, a single father facing a dynasty, a man with one vote and a mountain of truth. He closed the folder. Clarity settled inside him like a steady flame. Henry had trusted him, and he would not fail. The wind cut sharp and cold as Ethan approached Whitmore Industries the next morning. The tower rose like a monolith glass, gleaming with the indifference of power. His heart hammered, but his steps did not falter. He was done being small. Inside, the lobby buzzed with rumors. Executives stared openly, baffled that a man in a worn jacket walked through security without being stopped. Richard Hayes met him with a nod. "Remember," he said quietly, "Brandon expects fear. Give him truth." The private elevator carried them upward. Ethan's reflection in the polished steel looked like a man caught between terror and purpose. The boardroom erupted the moment he entered. Conversations snapped shut. Suits stiffened. Brandon Whitmore stood near the center, fury twisting his expression. "This is a circus," he barked. "He shouldn't even be in the building." The chairwoman spoke over him. "Mr. Miller's vote grants him the right to speak." Ethan stepped forward. The room seemed to lean toward him, waiting for him to crumble. But he looked at the polished table, the sea of skeptical faces, and thought of Henry sitting alone in a diner booth, hoping to be seen. "I'm not a businessman," he began, voice steady. "I served Mr. Whitmore coffee, I cut his toast, and I listened." A few people exchanged confused glances. Ethan continued. "He didn't trust many, but he trusted me with the truth." He laid the first document on the table. "This is evidence of funds being siphoned from Whitmore subsidiaries. Another, falsified audits. Another, attempts to manipulate board votes." Murmurs erupted, sharp and rising. Brandon lunged forward. "These are lies. He's a nobody trying to steal everything." Ethan met his gaze. "Being nobody is why Mr. Whitmore chose me. Because I couldn't be bought. Because I saw him when you stopped looking." The room fell silent. Hayes stood. "Independent auditors can verify these records. And will." Brandon's face drained. His voice scrambled. "You can't do this." "I'm family." But the board was already shifting. The chairwoman raised her hand. We will vote. The motions came swiftly. Remove Brandon Whitmore from all authority. Approved. Launch full investigation. Approved. Adopt the Whitmore Legacy Fund proposal. Approved unanimously. Brandon stared in disbelief as security approached. He didn't fight. His voice was barely a whisper. How did you beat me? Ethan answered quietly. It wasn't me. It was the truth. When Brandon was escorted out, the chairwoman turned to Ethan. You honored Henry's trust. Hayes touched Ethan's shoulder. He would be proud. Outside, sunlight spilled between buildings like a promise. Ethan breathed deeply for the first time in days. He reached home early. Noah bounded into his arms, laughing. Ethan held him tight, overwhelmed by relief. I missed you, Noah said. I missed you more, Ethan replied. That weekend, Maple Street Diner reopened under its new name, Whitmore's Corner. The booths were polished, the lights warmer, the air alive with voices. At the corner table, a brass plaque gleamed, Henry's seat where everyone is seen. Noah tugged Ethan's sleeve. Dad, does this mean we're safe now? Ethan looked around the diner at the families chatting, at the bustle of morning life, at the small kingdom Henry had entrusted to him. Yeah, he said softly. I think we are. He glanced at the plaque again, and a quiet warmth filled his chest. Henry had not left him money or power. He had left him purpose. A reminder that kindness could topple corruption, that integrity could outshine privilege, that even the most underestimated man could stand in a room full of giants and win. And in that small, transformed diner, Ethan Miller finally understood being nobody had never been a weakness. It had been his greatest strength. In the end, Ethan's journey reveals a truth experts in human behavior have long understood. Real power is never held by those who shout the loudest, but by those who stand firm when the world expects them to fall. Integrity disrupts corruption. Quiet courage dismantles entitlement. And one act of genuine kindness can ripple far enough to rewrite an entire legacy. Ethan did not win because he was wealthy or trained. He won because he embodied the one quality money cannot buy: character. If this story moved you or reminded you that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories with heart and impact. And before you go, drop a quick comment with just 3 words: I choose kindness.